Hello, and welcome back to Parley, the series where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic of your choice. This month, YatogamiOdin has chosen to talk about meaningful choices. Yatogami has written a pretty long intro to the Parley here, and I'm just going to read all of it, sit back, we're going to take our time, and I'm going to respond. I would like to request the Parley. Yatogami begins on the idea of meaningful choices. I originally raised this point in the game balance discussion, in the context of the deep satisfaction that comes from navigating a web of meaningful choices. I wanted to explore what sorts of things make choices feel more meaningful, as opposed to simply taking up space. To piggyback off iPatchNote's recent Parley, it's my belief that every game asset is implemented with intent. The game devs must spend time and resources on every additional game piece. However, time and resources are not unlimited, so time and resources spent on one game piece are not being spent on another game piece. Therefore, there's a non-trivial cost to giving players a wide variety of game pieces. Each one of those pieces is liable to be less polished than if the devs had concentrated their efforts on fewer pieces. From a negative example, the game Mass Builder, mentioned in my previous Parley, it's returned, has an egregiously large number of nodes in its 3 tech trees that primarily serve as resource sink, and thus an incentive for repeated mission play, grinding. Without getting into the details, the number of meaningful decisions is a small fraction of the total number of choices presented to the player. Everything else is incremental stat boosts. Oh dear. Oh no. For a mixed example, a Warframe player with a mature account has access to several sources of most any desired stat. To focus on the semi-recent weapon arcanes, the choice between Merciless Deadhead or Dexterity on your primary secondary has significant gameplay asks and implications, and all of these can free up space that would otherwise be spent on a damage mod. These arcanes are now in competition with the new offerings from the Zeraman, increasing the number of considerations a player might wish to take into account. However, Warframe also has a number of game pieces that have difficulty justifying their presence in the loadout. The physical damage mods for existence, only operate on the matching portions of the weapon's damage, which doesn't justify their existence. I think that's where I was going. Instead of operating on the total base damage as elemental damage mods do. The choice to use these mods exists, but does not offer anything unique or special to the player, most of the time. You can confabulate a situation where they're good, but that's beside the point. For a positive, if relatively uninformed example, Hades seems like the kind of game with a small number of major build decisions. I would agree, I think that's a good example. At the surface, there are 6 infernal arms, each of which has a number of aspects. While some aspects can be boiled down to numerical increases, the ones I looked over all seem to ask for and or reward a more specialized playstyle. I think these kinds of gameplay shifts are necessarily significant to the player. Yeah, and a lot of Hades boons are quite immediately noticeable. There's very few that are just the, passive damage increase. In fact, I think those are actually kind of welcome in the context of a game that doesn't really have more of that effect. To get to the actual core of the Parley, what do you think are the primary dev side considerations for presenting the player with meaningful choices? Perhaps more critically, if a game piece fails to present a meaningful choice, under what conditions should the devs rebalance that game piece, if any? In other words, at what point should the devs focus on adding new game pieces instead of adjusting old ones, especially for live service games like Warframe and Genshin Impact? And then we get a spoiler out part for later. So, a very long intro, some great examples that I hope gave you all a good framework for what we're talking about here. This idea that oftentimes it feels like quantity and quality have this parasitic relationship. If you make, there's a couple examples actually, let's start there. If you make a game that has a lot of different options, you could make a few of them very polished and then make the rest of them just be like filler that does not matter. And this is not an uncommon approach. It sounds like Mass Builder is doing this. I think Path of Exile is somewhat guilty of this, although personally I think they've done it in an interesting way. You could make a game with a medium density of choices that are, only so meaningful. I think Warframe is a game that is doing some interesting stuff here. Warframe has a medium number of meaningful choices, and we're going to get back to some of those choices later too. Some of them are not very meaningful, but I think Warframe is doing something different there. They're not filler, in my opinion, in the same way they are in Mass Builder, arguably in Path of Exile sometimes. Anyway, for a bit later. Warframe also is a game that is designed in such a way where options don't have to be balanced so much. I think it's important to dig into this idea. You said each one of those pieces is less likely to be polished than if the devs had concentrated their efforts. But really, polished here, a lot of what that means is balanced, that they are worth using, basically. Again, balanced meaning that they are worth using. I know some people think balanced and they've been conditioned to think that means that it's weak. Remember, we mean good balanced, which means that it's worth using good. Everything being overpowered is ideally the feeling of balance, I guess. I don't know. Where overpowered just means impactful. You notice the difference. Balanced in a good way. Okay. And so really, I think that the lack of polish in practice, a lot of what that means is that the piece won't be as balanced of a choice. It'll just be bad, or it might be overpowered, I guess. And then the other pieces won't feel as relevant. But really, I think for this parlay, we're more talking about that piece just won't be that interesting, or there won't be as much support, or it won't interact with the game in a coherent way as much. And I think that here Warframe does a bit of a cheat in that the game is open-ended enough, or doesn't have a specific enough level of challenge for that to be as much of a problem, which allows the pieces to be more flexibly balanced, let's say it that way. Now, I personally have said many times before, and will say again, that I think Warframe is also just badly balanced. It is a game that's designed in a way where you could balance it less well and that would work, but that the game separately has a problem where I do not think that the game is developed in a way that feels like it lines up with the game those things are being developed for. And we've talked about this for years. I don't really know why. It's really a topic for another time. But just to say there's a difference between those two things. Don't get distracted by the individual examples here. But I do think Warframe has a noteworthy approach in that the game is simply rather flexible. It can endure some level of a little less polish for each individual element, which in theory is an interesting idea. I'll put my cards on the table and I'll talk about this more later. I actually think Warframe addresses this problem very well in a lot of ways. And then separately, unfortunately, however, the developers also just don't balance the game that well. But if they did, I think that Warframe would be a game that really showed excellence as a response to this question in a lot of ways. So it's a great example here. Hades, yes. Hades, I think, is a fairly extreme example. Hades is a game that has not very many choices. And so, yeah, they have a lot of attention applied to them. Hades, when you start making builds in it and get familiar with all the options, feels almost like a puzzle box that you're unlocking and moving around the different pieces of and finding, oh, I'm going to use this, or I got this boon. What does that do to all the other boons? And it feels, to me, like you can feel the developer there. They're with you. They know that you're going to think those things. They tested it so much. Now, I happen to know that for Hades, the developers, Supergiant, had an approach where they basically set aside like the final hour or so of work every day, where everybody in the office stops what they're doing and we play. And everybody just played the game. And you can really tell, like, this is the type of thing where I do strongly believe that this ultimately boils down to playtesting. It just shows if you haven't playtested the game. In Warframe, I think whatever playtesting they're using, it just doesn't work, and it shows. There's a lot of options where the people going through the thought process of would I pick this or not just don't want to use it because the developers did not adequately go through that process or didn't listen to the people that did. I don't know. It doesn't matter for now. But Hades is a game where you can really feel that. I feel like it's a game where the developer's right there with you, playing right alongside you, saying, oh yeah, you're going to want to pick those things now. And you're like, yeah, whoa, you read my mind, which is an awesome feeling. But I would argue becomes a little impossible once the number of options reaches crazy pants. So something to think about. Therefore, I think it's useful to actually categorize games a bit more. We've got maybe 3 types of games here. One, I'm going to call puzzle box games. Unfortunately, iPatch Notes, you mentioned in this parlay, you and I have talked about the idea of a puzzle box game as something a bit different. I guess it is similar. It is very close, but unfortunately, I'm going to use that term. I'm sorry. Puzzle box games, which here are going to mean a game that has a very large quality of choices and generally very low quantity, where it feels like all the choices were manually pinned together like on a conspiracy theory board, to intricately work together. These games will tend to be eminently well balanced, almost preternaturally well balanced, and there will be a lot of really interesting emergent options if you go digging for them, because the developer did go digging for them, because there's a small enough number of options that they could dig deep on literally every single one. They probably have a web of like this boon, every single boon has its own little page of these are the things that are like interesting with this boon, or what does this boon do to the game. You could absolutely make a whole YouTube channel that would last about 10 years where you just reviewed every single boon in Hades. And you could do a 10-15 minute video on each one. I wouldn't hate that, but I'm not going to do it. Anyway, that's a thing. So that's one kind of game. We can call these high quality over quantity games if you wanted to. Supergiant's own Pyre is also another very good example. Pyre is another game that has an incredibly small number of choices, but they have a very large impact on gameplay. A much more extremely small number of choices. And I would argue that Pyre isn't actually so intricately wrought. It's just not really the focus of that game, in my opinion. But that, yeah. Anyway, Hades. A second type of game, this is where Mass Builder and the Path of Exile games are going to be. I'm going to call these games that their approach is to add filler. So they have a number of nodes that are good quality over quantity, but they also have a lot of quantity, and they've done that by not making all the nodes equal. They have many nodes which are extraordinarily simple, uninteresting on their own, but may become interesting. I think Path of Exile does this well in the context of them being like on the way to another node. Path of Exile has a lot of nodes where you just get a stat increase, which is pretty boring. And a lot of the time, you're actually not choosing to take that node exactly. You're choosing to take that node to get to another node on the tree that you want to get to. And that node does have a meaningful choice attached to it. The small nodes with little stat increases on the way aren't exciting on their own when you get them, but they do become a somewhat exciting choice in the context of being things you get on the way to an exciting choice. They become kind of a little extra that you get there, which I do think salvages them a little bit. They kind of get attached to those more interesting choices. Again, I'm not trying to say one strategy or another is better here. I'm trying to say I think there are count them three, winning strategies for approaching this problem that I can think of. Quality over quantity, hardcore. Filler nodes, so still quality over quantity, but you still get quantity and you use filler to achieve it. And maybe that filler gets recontextualized on the way. And then whatever we're going to call Warframe's example. And this one is going to be using, I want to talk specifically about Warframe having mods that are not meant to be meaningful choices, because I believe that's a good thing. I believe Warframe does that in a sometimes good way. Warframe is a complicated game. There's a lot of different parts. And I have different things to say about the buildcraft of a lot of those different parts. But one thing that I think is an example of Warframe putting something in that is not supposed to be interesting, but that is a good thing, are like base damage mods. Multi-shot is really the good example. Multi-shot in Warframe is what it sounds like. You get more bullet with your bullet, and it is designed in such a way where this is almost 100% of the time a good stat and the best stat for a weapon. It gives you more critical consistency, it gives you more status output, it gives you more damage. It's a multiplier on all of your damage because you're literally multiplying the number of bullets you get. It can make your weapons more accurate because you're literally getting more bullets. You can trigger effects more often. There's many, many good things about multi-shot. And because of that, it is pretty much the first thing that you'd add to a lot of weapons after base damage. We'll come back to that. I think this is good. I think it's good because, one, it means that there is a type of effect which you can rely on. You have a build, it's an empty build, and I believe when you're making a build, it is very good to give the player kind of a freebie. Invite them to start making a build. Just like the best writing advice, the best creative advice is start. Just put a word on the page. It's like that. I very strongly believe that no matter what kind of person you are, it's not a bad idea to allow the player to just put a mod on. It's kind of nice to be able to just pick a mod. Magic the Gathering, I believe, does quite a good job of this as well in a different context. I'll get back to that example later. But in short, basically, for many decks in many Magic the Gathering formats, there are some cards that are blatantly obvious inclusions, and it gets less and less obvious from there, which I believe is good, usually desirable. You don't have to use them if you don't want to, and there generally is some benefit to not using them. There will be some corner case where you don't want to use Soul Ring in a commander deck in Magic, for example. But you usually do, and I just don't think that's bad a lot of the time. It can get out of hand, don't get me wrong. If you have a bunch of mods that feel uninteresting but obviously good to equip, and that fills all your space, or your entire deck in Magic, yeah, that's bad, but I don't think that these games are usually in those situations. And when they are, I think the developers have done something about it to balance that down. Anyway, I've often given the example in Warframe that, you slap on your base damage mod, we'll get back to it, your multi-shot mod, maybe crit mods if the weapon is crit, but you're making a little bit more of a choice there, and which crit mod. Now we have kind of multiple options for crit mods. And then you choose to add status damage types or elemental damage types. The status ones are not, fire rate or not, and suddenly you're making more choices. I do think Warframe is a little bit tight here. A criticism that's often been leveled is that, yeah, okay, maybe for multi-shot, people say, but what about base damage? I mean, it's literally just a number. Why don't you just make the number on the weapons bigger? Everything is just that, like, multi-shot's just the number too. But okay, I mean, I think that base damage is still a good thing because it's meant to be a progression mechanic. It's meant to be something where you get your base damage mod, it's got like 10 ranks, most of them do, or the ones that are 5 ranks make the weapon easier to use for a newer player. And these let you build up something as you progress through the game. That is a progression mechanic. You might say that isn't that kind of awkward? Warframe wants to have a lot of progression mechanics, so you feel like you're always progressing in different ways. And it does fill the double duty of giving you a mod that is good most of the time. I also personally like the idea that Warframe's weapons have been made in such a way that unmodded, they're all pretty weak, and you need to get a weapon modded up to increase its damage by a lot, such that even a powerful weapon isn't as valuable to you if you get it early when you don't have mods to support it. This is kind of interesting and noteworthy as well because Warframe makes most of its money by you buying weapons and Warframes from the cash shop and Prime Access, meaning players do regularly get weapons way ahead of when they would, and those weapons are made a lot less overpowered than they would be by getting most of their damage from mods. So I hope you can see at least that even if you don't like the results of those decisions, they're non-trivial to remove from the game. There is a lot of different effects they have. They invite the player to start putting some mods in their build. They give the player a progression system. They avoid the issue of the game's intended way of you making money, ruining the gameplay balance for most players, etc. Again, they don't do all those things perfectly. They don't do all those things for everyone. It doesn't always work, but there are a lot of reasons why those mods exist. The example you gave, Yatogami, I think is a great counterexample, the idea of the elemental and versus physical damage mods. The physical damage mods and elemental damage mods are in the same damage layer. They're not multiplicative with each other. They're not separate multipliers. But the physical damage mods only increase the weapon's damage for that multiplier by the amount of that physical damage type the weapon has. So if a weapon is even parts impact, puncture, slash, then a physical damage mod and an elemental damage mod that both give the same amount, but one of them is a physical damage mod, the physical damage mod is way worse because it only gives you 33% of whatever it gave. The weapon only has that much, I don't know, puncture, let's say. Whereas the elemental damage mod doesn't give you more of what the weapon has, it just adds that. That's very unclear, and it makes physical damage mods almost always bad. Sometimes the weapon is almost all a damage type, and or you really want more of that status effect, but very, very rarely. That's not common. Or sometimes you have nothing else to put on your weapon, but even more damage mods. And then, yeah, like the only thing left is to put on a physical damage mod, sure. But that's not really them being good. You would just put on something else if they weren't there. They are an awkward part of the game. Warframe has a lot of growing pains this way, but personally I believe that that's a bit of a distraction for this type of discussion. This is a growing pain problem. I don't think that Warframe is unable to fix this issue, by the way, but I think it would be fairly easy to fix. You could buff the physical damage mods. A lot of them actually do have places they'd be useful nowadays if they weren't such a bad amount of physical damage. If only they gave you a good amount of it, then they would occasionally be very useful. But they don't, so they're not. They are still very occasionally very useful. So I'm not trying to say there's no solution, but personally, I feel that this isn't a design decision anymore. So I'd like to go back to this point you made at the beginning. You know, in a previous parlay, you said we had this whole thing about every game asset being implemented with intent. I really believe you've misunderstood what I meant when I said that I don't completely agree with that. I just meant that there's a reason they put it in. They had to put it in on purpose. They didn't develop things by accident. Of course, that's ridiculous. That's not even possible. All I meant is that when people put something in a game, they don't always put it in with an idea in mind, with a picture in mind of exactly how the player will use it. Their reasoning, their intent might be, we're intentionally not going to choose exactly how this will be good because that is how our game is developed. We're going to put it in and try to make the stats reasonable so that it will emergently work with other things in the game. We intend that non-specific outcome. That's what I kind of meant by no specific intent. Obviously, they cannot possibly have no intent. Does that make sense? And I feel this is a case like that, a little bit, where, you know, the physical damage mods having a lower damage value is no longer their design intention. Like, they were originally put in for some reason, and now it's been like 9 years and Warframe has changed in all these ways. So whatever that reason was, that context is gone. It is no longer comprehensible, whatever the original design intent of these physical damage mods was. They just are at the moment. They just are what they are. They're not that way because the developers intend them to be that way anymore, because the context around whatever specific or non-specific intention they once had is gone. So I do think Warframe has a lot of distractions as well. A lot of parts of Warframe aren't the way they are for any reason anymore. They just still are that way, and the developers have yet to have updated or changed them to kind of get with the times or whatever. And to be fair, they do actually update these things fairly often. There's just a lot of stuff. Very frequently, most large updates, there are large amounts of the game that are way out of date that get brought a bit up to date, or the developers had a better idea and so they update that thing. I would also like to point out that we can't always know these things. Developer intention is elusive, what exactly it is. And again, I would argue there's a meaningful difference between developer intent that is about, like, they put this in with a specific intention in mind, rather than like they have a plan, they know why they're putting it in the game, but the reason why isn't a specific reason. It's like a more philosophical, general, this is how we're making the game kind of reason, rather than this will be good with these things. They don't know that. They don't have that kind of intent. But obviously they have to still have some reason they're putting it in. Even if that reason is merely, we need to sell more weapons, we need more weapons in this update, come up with some ideas for weapons. Players like having a grenade launcher mounted on their weapon as an alternate fire, let's put that in. Developers, I'm not making fun of you, I think that's a pretty good intention actually. But my point is, I don't think it's useful to treat that type of intention as equal to the type of intention where you put a thing in a game with vascular knowledge of where and how it will be useful, which is something I think like Hades and Path of Exile do a lot. All the things in those games are clearly, you can very keenly feel that those things are put in the game with a specific type of interaction in mind. Warframe doesn't really do this, I would argue. This is a place where, it doesn't never do it, but I think usually it doesn't do it. The type of intention is broader, maybe. What I wanted to get at is that Warframe can do that, can take that approach, this kind of third winning strategy for developing a game with good choices, is shenanigans. So one of those shenanigans would be, there are some boring choices that cause there to be a large quantity, but those boring choices serve a purpose that I believe informs the qualitative choices. Choosing your eighth mod on a Warframe weapon is quite meaningful. Choosing your first mod on a Warframe weapon is usually no thought at all, but I don't think those things have a parasitic relationship. I think that in a different way from in Path of Exile and Mass Builder, the boring choice has a good relationship with the interesting choice. It's just kind of the opposite. The boring choice gets you going to the interesting choice, whereas in Path of Exile, Mass Builder, these tree-based games, the interesting choice makes the boring choice more interesting. That's how I would word it anyway. By being something that you get as extra, you kind of have to get it on the way there. Whereas these boring choices in Warframe, these mandatory seeming mods that are always good, designed to be always good, these have the benefit of giving you a little bit of a start, a little push to go make a build so that you can decide what that eighth mod will be. It helps you get there rather than being something you get along the way, if that makes sense. And Warframe pulls some other shenanigans as well, like the whole thing about the game not being so keenly balanced that you need to carefully balance your options, meaning that things can feel more appropriate in the game without being as precisely calibrated toward other things. I also think there's a discussion you could have here about making effects be more based on numbers. In Warframe, the difference between a lot of weapons and how they do damage is their visual and physical radius where they do that damage. They look, sound, feel different, and explode in different ways. That does offer you the ability to make weapons very similar numerically while making them still different in some meaningful ways. They have, kinesthetic differences. They have handling differences, like recoil and stuff. Whereas, for example, in Path of Exile, a lot of the differences between the ways you do damage are literally the damage is calculated differently, meaning you do have to get out the calculator and use a different equation to make sure that's actually balanced in theory, and then even then there'll be practical differences. That is in some ways harder, I would suggest. They're different processes, but I do think that, if you develop a game the way Warframe has, you are in some way doing yourself a favor to make things that feel truly different while making them reliably similar in power level. That is something that is challenging to do in a game like Path of Exile. Again, I mean, it's challenging in that it takes a lot of time. You have to do a bunch of math and test it and stuff. And even then, it can be hard to know, but you get the point. Yeah. So that's what I think about the dev considerations for presenting the player with meaningful choices. That part of the question, that's what I think. I think that the developer would want to think carefully about whether or not these pieces are fulfilling the role of being an interesting choice, or are they filling out the game's depth? And why? Do you just want the player to play more, I guess? Could you make them interesting some other way? Trying to get them to do as much as possible is good. And of course, having a game that has all these intricate options, but they're all really deep and interesting, is not impossible, would be maybe theoretically cool, but it would just cause such an overload of managing the different... I mean, Path of Exile also takes kind of a nuclear approach, right? It would take so much management to make all those things work together in a way where they felt meaningful, and there wasn't just one ridiculously overpowered combination to use that would make the others feel meaningless to a lot of players. And by the way, not all players care about that kind of thing, but a lot of people do. That would undermine the meaning of the choice for many people. And Path of Exile kind of cheats at solving this by just resetting every so often. So, they can iterate. This is a good way to refine a game's balance. But I would argue that it kind of gets away with having incomplete balance with this incomprehensibly large system by not letting you go into it too much. You can't fully find out just how broken certain things would be before they'll change it again, is somewhat the idea. That's how I feel when I play, in any case. Which is an interesting approach, but again, not entirely... it's not like they just have a bunch of complicated options and it just works. Like, it doesn't. Like, that's not a thing. It doesn't. And Warframe also isn't that way. They are kind of taking a shortcut in some way. And Hades, an example of a game that maybe isn't taking that shortcut, well, there are a lot less options. I don't think there's a small number of options, but there are a lot less options in Hades. Okay, cool. Really went on about that because I think it's quite interesting. I'll get to the other part of the question now. If a game piece fails to present a meaningful choice, under what conditions should devs rebalance that game piece, if any? At what point should devs focus on adding new game pieces instead of adjusting old ones, especially for live service games like Warframe and Genshin Impact? So, first of all, I'd like to marathon uh, some reasons why it would be good to go back. I think that developers generally don't go back to their previous game pieces very much. Why? Well, I guess it's because they're less exciting to players. I guess it's because they think that the player doesn't care about something that just has been in the game for a long time and gets updated. Whereas if something is new, they'll get it newly, they'll try it out, they'll get used to it. They don't have a bias formed about it yet or whatever. Personally, I feel like maybe this is something that developers assume more than we're sure is necessarily true. I don't know. But for example, what if you update, an old mod in Warframe or something, and yeah, players already have it. If you just update it, it's not like they'll get it anew and it'll be this shiny new thing. But what if you just tell the player that it's a shiny new thing, not lying to them, but have a pop-up, or something when you log into the game that says, hey, this is a new thing we did. Never mind that it is a revision of an old thing, but it is a new effect or a significantly different effect, like the one you had. And look, you own this item. You have this thing. I think that just framing it differently means you can go back and revise those things and keep them somewhat exciting. Another point is that it takes less work. A lot of the time you can do this by just changing numbers on an effect. And at the very least, you have chiseled out design space for this thing already. And if you want to eliminate it, well, that might take just some work to figure out what to do with it. But you can tackle it. It's already there. You can make it do something totally different. That's even more like a new thing. And again, people already have it. Hopefully, this won't make people too upset. Everything inevitably makes people upset. Change always makes people upset. But my point is, there's a way in which, yeah, you might have to do a little more work to get players excited about changing something that's already in the game, but it's also often less work to change something that's already in the game. So I feel like that kind of if the more work that compensates for that is you have to put a pop-up on the screen to tell the player that the thing was changed, because they won't just organically get a new thing. I don't know. I don't think that's so bad. For what it's worth, I believe that games are currently in a sort of adolescent phase where they are getting better at communicating. I feel like that thing I just described is much more common than it used to be. I've played a lot of games for decades now that hardly ever did that in the past, but now do it much more often, or do it in a more effective way, or both revise old things and or let the player know that that has happened. Going back to those older things has become a more common practice. Or a lot of games, I feel like I've just been impressed by how quickly they do it. A good example would be Final Fantasy XIV. Here's a little funny anecdote for you. Final Fantasy XIV is pretty notorious now for suspending sales of it because the servers were too full and it was doing so well they literally couldn't buy more servers. So they did a great thing. They said, we're not going to sell the game anymore. You wouldn't be able to play it. That's wrong. People hardly ever do this. They would just keep selling the game and, oh, it's busy. Too bad, Most places don't close because they're too busy. But if they have integrity as a business, they do. And this game developer said, we're going to stop selling the game. Great. Don't know how they convinced the publisher. But anyway, they did it, okay? And they eventually restarted selling the game. And I thought to myself, I've been wanting to play this game for a while. I've waited long enough. I'm going to go now. I've waited long enough. It's finally available again. This is my chance. And wouldn't you know it, after having an unprecedentedly huge influx of players, if you were me, what would you do? You would update the new player experience. You would make a beeline for doing that as soon as possible. And that's exactly what they did, which makes me very happy, but also very sad because I started playing right before they started updating the new player experience, meaning I was one of the last people to get the bad version of it before they helped revise it. I mean, it's still a work in progress, but you get the point. I do personally feel like I see that thing more in the games I play. I hear about that thing more from other players and in the news. And when games want to show you something they've made, new or old, a change they've made, I feel like games communication has greatly improved. Games having patch notes in the game, games giving you a little note in the game that explains these things, etc. I feel like that's gotten much better recently, which is really good. It's quite a quite new stage of development for games, which maybe is a statement about their age. It's very young, but we're getting there. We're growing up as the gaming industry, and we're doing that by communicating better. So I think a lot of the problem with going back to old pieces is just that, is really just communication. I think it's almost always better to go back to old pieces if they deserve the revisions. Again, I think a lot of the time this seems like an easy play, but people seem to overlook the development considerations. In Genshin Impact, for example, there are some starting characters that you get when you start playing the game. They give you a team to get going and play the game with, interact with the elements. And these characters are made intentionally weak. They have purpose. They still do unique things. And so, in theory, they are still useful. And indeed, having these characters like everyone else does, I do use most of them from, I don't use Amber that much, but Kaya and Lisa are plenty useful to essentially all accounts, as long as you are willing to build them out. But it makes sense that maybe they should go back and buff them a bit. There's other characters like Diluc and especially Kuching, these 5-star characters that have been in the game for a long time. These characters are, you might say, a little bit power crept. They're just kind of straightforward. They're not really bad. It's just like, why? Like, why do they have to be so simple? The game has kind of moved on from that. Do they still need to be this way? And there's an argument then that they should go back and revise them. But there is some other incentive there. Again, just like with Warframe, you might say, oh, but the base damage mods are just boring. And most of the time this feedback is given. I'm not really speaking directly to you, Yatogami, but in general, I think that players just are unaware that there is a good reason that may or may not matter for them, but is a theoretically good reason for the thing to be that way. To the players, they say, well, there's no point in this being that way. And I believe that's very arrogant. Like, you just don't know what the point is. If you want to start listing points and try to demonstrate that maybe you have thought about a lot of different options, but you just can't see one, a better way to present this feedback, what I try to do myself and sometimes fail, is to say, I just don't see why this needs to be that way. And developers, I think it wouldn't be so bad to even more communicate about these things. Say, when you get the base damage mod, when people click the modding tutorial, we have these, and this is why these are in the game. Or like, multi-shot is basically always good. That's the point of it. You want the player to think of it that way. It's advantageous for the player to think of it that way. Just tell them that's what you think about it. And of course, sometimes this plays the developer's hand. There are some tips in Warframe on Warframes, when you look at a Warframe's abilities, that they say things that you could do with the frame that are not good things to do. They're not effective if you actually do them, which sort of tips the developer's hand a little bit. They didn't actually try doing those things at the levels of gameplay that you're trying to do them at. They don't actually know if those things are effective, which is unfortunate. But again, that's like, that shouldn't be a problem in the first place. That's, you know, play test better, really, for goodness sakes. And again, that's a bit specific to Warframe. Cool. I think that old pieces are a good thing to revise. I think the main reason not to would be, again, that it's not this new shiny thing, but I do believe that you can use communication to largely present it like that. And another great trick is mixing in your old but revised piece, which is now basically a new game piece, with a genuinely new game piece. I think that's a great approach. Buff a character and give them a rerun with a new character. And say that the character is meaningfully different when players try them. I don't know. I don't really see why games don't say these things more often. It just feels weird. Like, communicate better. The devs know why they're doing those things. Why don't they tell the player? I don't know. Again, maybe sometimes I think they don't, but a lot of the time they probably do. The devs might just think, oh, we should buff this for like no specific reason, but they're intending, you know, the player will hopefully use it more. I don't know. Anyway, I do think that going back to the old things is very good. I think that's underdone. I think people should do that more. I think that's a good thing to do. It can be easy to do. Yes, you have to communicate a bit more, but I don't think that. I think you break more than even. It's still easier to update an old piece and then communicate than making an entirely new piece. Mixing the two is good. Like, you're still going to make new things. A lot of the time, the old pieces are the new player experience. That was the point of that Final Fantasy XIV anecdote. A lot of the times, the old pieces will be what the player sees before the new pieces. So there is, I mean, that should just be obvious, but apparently not to a lot of games, because the old part of the game is horribly neglected. Having older players play the old part of the game, the players playing the new stuff, having that be where the old stuff is, isn't the worst idea. You might be able to figure that out. There's various solutions to that these games have taken, but we have little time and we must get to your spoilered out part. So I'm going to read that too. I hope I sold you the idea that there are good reasons to go back and revise the old pieces, and that a lot of the reason that it wouldn't be good is basically just bad communication, I think, which games are getting rapidly better at, and wouldn't you know it, they're also revising older things more often, because that's the main reason you wouldn't be able to do that and get as much, I don't know, excitement from the player, because it doesn't feel like a new thing or whatever. Yeah, there's some other things in my notes that I don't think are that relevant anymore, but just very quickly, I said, you could make that older thing, instead of making it as good as the newer things, like buffing it up or something, it could have a new place given the context of your game currently. Warframe has done this a lot. Things that became kind of out of date were updated, but given a new niche in the game as, a medium mastery rank weapon, or a mod that you use toward the beginning of the game, and then eventually it becomes a little bit moot, etc. This is something that you can do. Rather than making the old thing literally just as good as everything else, you can still utilize it as part of the game. I think it's very rarely a good idea to make a new thing to fulfill that role when there are old derelict things waiting to fill the space. Because players do get excited when their thing they already have becomes suddenly like better. Anyway, to read your spoilered part to finish out this parlay, Yatogami says, from my perspective as a player consumer and armchair dev, I'd say that the game's scope has a large effect on how well the game pieces can be calibrated. Yep, if there's less of them, they should be able to be balanced better. It goes without saying, a small number of game pieces makes it easier to map, and therefore adjust, interactions between said game pieces. In light of finite dev time and resources, I'd prefer a small selection of more refined game pieces. And I had responded before that I think the approach where you have a lot of game pieces, but you kind of cheat a little bit to make there be some less meaningful game pieces, but they become useful in context in some ways. I don't think that's a bad approach either. I think people like having a lot of stuff too. I don't think that's so bad. And again, I think that these intricate games, puzzle box, quality over quantity games, Hades, these types of games do sometimes seem inaccessible to a player. They feel like each choice is quite meaningful, very heavy, which isn't always ideal. Like, I do think that's a trade-off. I like these kinds of games a lot. I would say of the three approaches, I love these. I feel like it's a treasure whenever I find these. Hades is a gold mine for my type of preference. But I do want to note how I feel like they do have a pretty significant drawback for a lot of kinds of folks. A lot of people want to make a build, but don't feel that the same way about that maybe I do, maybe you do. And I do think that's a weakness of those games, whereas these other games can do it all, but they do pay a price. I don't think it's better or worse, but there definitely are different advantages in my opinion. Continuing on. As for the adjustment of game pieces post-release, I think devs have a responsibility to maximize the health and balance of their games. Like the devs, players have a finite amount of time and resources to spend on games, so it's only fair that the devs work to maximize the returns on the players' investments as well as their own. This goes double for live service games, which continually deliver an evolving product to their player consumers. In summary, I hold the continued existence or misguided or misfit game pieces in live service games as an act of neglect on the part of the devs. This is a lot stronger than the way I put it. The idea that healthy games and marketable games are not necessarily the same thing is the subject best left to a future parlay. Yeah, this is it's a whole can of worms there. But I think that's an interesting point to end on. We did it. It's fun to see how to what degree I cover these points before we read the spoiler part. But yeah, this whole point about you said it a lot stronger than I did. I think that it's kind of pointless not to go back and revise your older game pieces. And you've said something kind of different, a bit of a stronger claim. It like the developers are in some way sort of supposed to, or they've signed up to revise those older pieces. And again, there's the boogeyman here is if that wouldn't make them as much money, then they're not going to, no matter what we say. My argument hinges, therefore, on the idea that it could make them as much, if not more, money. It can make updates seem bigger. Putting the old thing alongside the new things, I really think is a winning strategy that games should do more. When you release new Warframe augments, also revise some Warframe augments. And when you make a graphic showing them all, show the revised ones right there alongside them. This is easy money. I don't know. That's what I think. You don't just show them all the same. Make a little divider line and say revise, new. That's fine. What's wrong with that? And then there would be way more augments that players are thinking, whoa, look at all these new effects. Or in Genshin Impact, buff a character when they get a rerun. And then people are excited, like, oh, I wasn't interested in this character the first time around, but look, they are kind of different. And there's this other character. And make a splash art picture where there's a little up arrow and it says, like, Arataki Ito buffed. And then you see Kuki Shinobu, a new character. I don't know. I just don't think this is that hard. This is pretty much just agreeing with you, Yatogami, but I really do feel like I don't know. To me, this feels very basic. I'll put my cards on the table fully about this. I think it is a little silly that developers don't do these things. I don't see why not. I'll say it that way. It seems like a win all around. And again, it's something that often they do, but they just don't present it this way. I don't know. Like, is there a shame in your old game pieces? Do people think like, oh, that's recycling the same thing over and over again? Is that why they're worried about that? This is a place where I make this type of argument a lot, so I'll be careful here. This is a place where I'm going to say something I say often. I'm acknowledging this. I don't know that they know that. I don't know that anybody knows that the players would react by saying, oh, wow, you went back and revised these older things. That's just you recycling things from before. I think that at the very least, in a game like Warframe, people who've been following the updates and are invested enough to be upset about new content, which is just stupid in the first place. But anyway, not very many people. They've been following along. That's how they can be upset about new things, because they're way too invested in this one game. They're going to see this new thing, and it is literally just more augments. And they'll say like, oh, they're recycling the content or whatever. And right below that, someone will comment and say, this is literally just the same number of augments as normal, and also some new ones. I don't know. You can see I'm getting a bit incensed about this topic. It really kind of beggars belief to me that this isn't just an obvious thing to do. Like, why not do this? I don't understand. And again, much of the time it's like they're literally just hiding the changes they did make. They did this and just didn't tell people, basically. It's in the patch notes rather than... Anyway, so it's quite interesting. I'm sorry, I want to dig into what you said. You activated something in me there, Yatogami. You talking about the idea that the devs have a responsibility, financially anyway, to efficiently revise the old things. That's my opinion. But yeah, I think that the idea that the players are kind of paying for the developer to do this thing, this is a place where I can't help but come back to this. I run my own business, and I am keenly aware that, to be absolutely blunt, essentially no business has any integrity at all. Like, the idea that the business has a responsibility and so they should do that thing because it just feels like the right thing to do is, and this doesn't escape you or anyone else, just something that essentially nobody does. Like, people just don't do that. People's integrity is quite cheap. If they have to do it to make money, too bad. They will not do things that are good for the consumer and just hope the consumer values them, which is what I am doing. And I have to say, it feels great. Like, it's a really good feeling. Like, you all are fantastic. Thanks for catching me on the trampoline. Could have died there. And I understand why other people don't do it, but this is the type of argument that I feel like goes a bit past a lot of developers, or publishers at least. They do not have responsibilities. They're just gonna make a game, and there it is. And people will make the argument like, if the restaurant doesn't serve food you like, you can just leave. And I agree with you that I think that's kind of disingenuous. That's not really the social contract that a consumer and a business actually have. But businesses have been taking the piss out of that for as long as there have been businesses, which really frustrates me. I can share that feeling. I'm not sure I have anything to respond to with this, though. Yeah, I think games should respect the player's time, but there's this overbearing financial incentive. I want to talk about this while avoiding that thing, but I don't think you can. Like the only answer to this is, but it doesn't make them money and they don't care about anything else at the end of the day. And that will sound overly cynical. You might be thinking, sure, the game developers care about like the game being fun. Well, they do, but they're trying to do things that do both most of the time. It's not as simple as, is the thing only fun and doesn't make them money? Is the thing only something that makes them money and isn't fun? Myself included, we have a tendency to think of things that way. But the truth is that most developers of most games try to do things that do only both things, that are fun for the player in some way, in theory, and make the game more money. And if a thing doesn't do both, it's kind of out for most games. I think it's much more that than like they do the fun thing or they do the money thing. And there are a few people who, I was really popping off about myself earlier, but I'm not perfect about this either. I do the best I can. I wish I had more to say about this point. I'm sorry. It is really interesting, like this idea that you're absolutely right. Why did I overlook this in this 50-minute conversation about this topic? The developers do. It's hard to argue they don't have a responsibility to make the game like respect the player's time, sure. And that is exactly what revising the early game does. I think that the place where this is a win-win is in Final Fantasy XIV as an example. The early game is so bloated and there's so much content. Why do you need the player to wait that long to... I don't know, that it just seems like you could get some data on how long players play and when they quit and show that cutting out a bunch of story beats would do the job. And I think a lot of people, well, myself included, would say, well, yeah, but they have to adjust the flow of the story. Having played a good amount of the Final Fantasy XIV story at the beginning, they wouldn't. There's a lot of it you could cut out and change nothing, and it wouldn't make the story not make sense. A lot of it literally is just filler. And that's the place where I feel like I agree with you. There might have been places where the game was padded early in its lifespan, and a lot of the times the need for those has long passed. Just get rid of them. A big place, a really good example to end on where this is true, is in Warframe farming. There are like 50 Warframes. There is no longer any good reason to make Warframes take a long time to get. That just... I know that it's there. Again, you cannot discuss this topic without talking about the financial incentive. Obviously, it's because they want you to buy the version of the Warframe from the market or buy Platinum to buy the Prime from another player. Of course, that's why. But I do feel there's an argument here where like consumer confidence isn't valueless. And if you make Warframes easy to get when there's so many, players will still buy Warframes when they don't want to go get another Warframe after getting 5 more. They'll just like your game more. And it's not for me to say, neither do they know for sure, but they do have data on this, of course, that it would make them more money, maybe, if they just did that thing. They would still make some money from players still buying Warframes because they didn't want to farm them, and they would make some money from players liking their game instead of being frustrated with it. People will pay money for that. It's just how much. And yeah, I don't know. Someone who, this is the way I make, that thing I just said is the way I make all of the money that I make for a living. From all of you. And I don't know exactly how much that is worth. No one knows, of course. And they will have had statistics that said, we did this consumer-friendly thing. Was there an earning spike? Which really isn't data that proves or disproves that that is a good idea, but it is better than what I have. I'm just guessing. Absolutely. At the same time, it is a bit frustrating when it feels like there's an obvious win-win here to some extent. Would it really be so bad to just do this thing that would be good for the player? I don't know. And I admit that when I discuss parlay questions like this, I often fall into, I'm not sure I'm happy that I do this, but into this trap where I'm trying to design a game where the developer is forced to do things that are good for the player without not pursuing their financial incentives, because they will never do things good for the player if they don't fulfill their financial incentives. And like, there are developers who do that. Like Hades, I think, is a very consumer friendly game, for example. I feel a little ashamed of myself talking about this for 55 minutes when I spent all that time assuming that the developer would never do anything that the player like actually wants on their own. You have to design a game in such a way that they're backed into a corner where the only way for the game to make money is for them to do something that's good for the player. I do think that's a noteworthy cause. I think coming up with that kind of thing is obviously useful nowadays. But I've got to say, Yatogami, you got one up on me here. You're absolutely right. They should be considered to have a responsibility to the player to respect their time. They just don't respect their time. But I cannot disagree with you that they certainly should. Really nice end to the parlay. What a great question.